The proposed U.S. Senate bill, backed by President Donald Trump, which imposes 500% tariffs on countries trading with Russia, particularly those purchasing Russian oil, gas, uranium and other commodities, could have significant economic and geopolitical implications for nations like India and China, which are major buyers of Russian energy. Below is an analysis of the potential impacts on these countries based on the latest available information as of July 2, 2025, with a focus on India and China as well as broader implications for other trading partners. India has significantly increased its imports of Russian oil since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began in 2022, with over 40% of its oil imports now sourced from Russia, up from negligible amounts pre-conflict. India-Russia bilateral trade reached $68.7 billion in fiscal year 2024 to 2025, largely driven by discounted Russian crude oil. A 500% tariff on Indian goods entering the U.S. could severely impact key export sectors such as pharmaceuticals, textiles, IT services, and automotive components, which rely heavily on the U.S. market. The tariffs would drastically increase the cost of Indian exports to the U.S., potentially pricing them out of the market. For example, Indian refiners like Reliance Industries and Nayara Energy, which together account for 45% of Russia's Urals crude exports, could face higher costs if forced to pivot to alternative oil suppliers, as Russian oil is significantly cheaper. Higher export costs could lead to reduced trade revenue, impacting India's economy and potentially causing inflation if domestic energy prices rise due to sourcing more expensive oil from other regions like the Gulf. The tariffs could strain the growing U.S.-India strategic partnership, especially as India is negotiating an interim trade agreement with the U.S. to reduce tariffs and improve market access. The threat of punitive tariffs could complicate these talks, forcing India to balance its energy security needs with diplomatic relations. India defends its Russian oil purchases as critical for energy security and affordability. If forced to reduce reliance on Russian oil, India may face challenges securing alternative supplies at comparable prices, potentially affecting its energy-intensive economy. The tariffs could accelerate India's efforts to diversify energy sources, but this would require time and investment in new trade relationships, potentially with Middle Eastern or African suppliers. The bill includes a presidential waiver, allowing Trump to opt out of enforcing tariffs on a case-by-case basis. Given India's strategic importance and ongoing trade talks, Trump might use this flexibility to avoid imposing tariffs if India makes concessions, such as increased support for Ukraine or trade concessions. The bill has 84 co-sponsors and includes provisions to exempt countries supporting Ukraine, which could provide India some leeway if it demonstrates alignment with U.S. interests in the Ukraine conflict. China, which actually accounts for a significant portion of Russian oil purchases, together with India, that's about 70% of Russia's oil exports, is already, engaged in a trade war with the United States. A 500% tariff on Chinese goods would really exacerbate tensions, increasing costs for American consumers and, further straining global supply chains. Chinese exports to the United States, including electronics, machinery, and consumer goods, could become prohibitively expensive, potentially leading to reduced trade volumes. China's role as a global manufacturing hub means that tariff-induced price spikes could ripple through global markets, causing inflation and supply chain bottlenecks. The United States could also face domestic economic fallout, such as job losses and higher consumer prices, due to its reliance on Chinese imports. China's reliance on Russian oil and gas is substantial, but it actually has more diversified energy sources compared to India. However, shifting away from Russian energy could increase costs and require new infrastructure investments, which would impact China's economic growth. The tariffs could push China closer to Russia, reinforcing their strategic partnership as a counterbalance to Western pressure. This could complicate United States efforts to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically. China is likely to respond with retaliatory tariffs or other economic measures, escalating the United States-China trade war. This could destabilize global trade and financial markets, given China's economic weight. Russia has warned that the tariffs could hinder peace negotiations in Ukraine, as they may harden positions among its trading partners. China's role in potential peace talks could be undermined if it faces economic penalties. The bill's waiver clause could allow Trump to use tariffs as leverage in negotiations with China, potentially extracting concessions on trade or geopolitical issues without actually fully implementing the tariffs. China's large domestic market and diversified trade relationships may help it absorb some of the tariff impacts, though not without, significant economic strain. Countries like Turkey, Brazil, and some European nations that continue to trade with Russia, especially in energy, could also face tariffs as high as 500%. For example, Turkey's imports of Russian gas and oil could trigger penalties, and that might end up affecting its exports to the United States. Smaller economies with less diversified trade portfolios may face disproportionate impacts, since they just don't have the economic resilience of India or China to absorb such high tariffs. The tariffs could disrupt global energy markets, as countries scramble to replace Russian oil and gas, and that could potentially drive up global energy prices. Higher costs for goods from major exporters like India and China could contribute to global inflation, which would affect consumers worldwide. Affected countries may seek to deepen trade ties with non-Western blocs, such as BRICS, in order to mitigate the impact of U.S. tariffs, and this could potentially reshape global trade alignments. The bill reportedly includes carve-outs for countries actively supporting Ukraine, which could spare some European nations or others providing military or financial aid. This creates, an incentive for countries to align with U.S. policy on Ukraine to avoid tariffs. The bill, spearheaded by Senator Lindsey Graham and co-sponsored by 84 senators, is set to be introduced in August 2025. However, the Trump administration has previously pushed to soften the bill by changing "shall" to "may," making tariffs discretionary rather than mandatory. This suggests, honestly, some potential flexibility in implementation. Russia has noted the bill and warned that it could complicate Ukraine peace talks, indicating potential geopolitical fallout beyond just trade. Imposing 500% tariffs could harm the U.S. economy by increasing consumer prices and disrupting supply chains, particularly for goods from China. This may, temper the bill's enforcement, as Trump is reportedly cautious about derailing trade deals with India and China. The tariffs could lead to a broader trade war, with affected countries retaliating against U.S. exports, further destabilizing global markets. The Trump-backed bill proposing 500% tariffs on countries trading with Russia, particularly India and China, could have profound economic and geopolitical consequences. India faces risks to its export-driven sectors and energy security, potentially straining U.S.-India relations, though the presidential waiver and ongoing trade talks may mitigate impacts. China risks further escalation of its trade war with the U.S., with global supply chain disruptions likely, though its economic resilience and strategic ties with Russia could cushion some effects. Other trading partners face similar pressures, with exemptions possible for those supporting Ukraine. However, the bill's discretionary nature and U.S. domestic economic concerns suggest that full implementation is not guaranteed, and Trump may use the threat of tariffs as leverage in negotiations rather than enforcing them outright. The situation remains, pretty fluid, with significant implications for global trade and geopolitics as the bill progresses.